Welcome, dear friends, to a tale of heartbreak and hope, where the darkest of tragedies leads one man on an unexpected journey of redemption. Enjoy the story. Steve Thompson opened his eyes, squinting against the harsh morning sunlight flooding the hospital room. A gentle breeze wafted through the partially open window, stirring the crisp white curtains. Despite the peaceful September morning, his entire body throbbed with an excruciating pain that seemed to reach into his very soul. He tried to recall what had happened, but the memories that surfaced were too horrific to be true. Surely it was just a nightmare. "Good morning!" A cheerful voice broke through his thoughts as a nurse entered the room. Her name tag read, Lisa. She closed the window, saying, "That's enough fresh air for now. The doctor will be doing rounds soon." Lisa turned to Steve, her smile faltering slightly as she took in his confused expression. "Can you move at all?" she asked gently. Steve lifted his arms, immediately wincing at the sharp pain that shot through his body. "I can, but everything hurts like hell," he groaned. Lisa's brow furrowed. "Well, you were in quite an accident. Don't you remember?" Seeing the bewilderment in Steve's eyes, Lisa suddenly hesitated. She mumbled something about forgetting to turn off an iron and hurried out of the room. Steve lay there, his mind a jumble of fragmented memories and searing pain. He could recall flashes: a family outing, his wife's laughter, his son's excited chatter from the back seat. Then, screeching tires, the sickening crunch of metal, and darkness. But that couldn't be real, could it? He closed his eyes, trying to will away the panic rising in his chest. "It's just a bad dream," he muttered to himself. "When I open my eyes, I'll be home in bed, and Sarah will be there, and little Tommy." But when he opened his eyes, he was still in the sterile hospital room, alone with his fears and the beeping of machines. Dr. Leonard Green, head of the trauma unit at City General Hospital, was just about to start his rounds when Nurse Lisa knocked on his office door. "Dr. Green, it's about Mr. Thompson, the car crash victim. I think he might have memory loss," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Dr. Green nodded gravely. "I'll go see him now. Thank you, Lisa." As the doctor entered Steve's room, he could hear Lisa lingering in the hallway. He knew she hated being the bearer of bad news. They all did. You never knew how a patient would react to devastating information. "Mr. Thompson?" Dr. Green began, his voice calm and professional. "How are you feeling this morning?" Steve looked at the doctor, his eyes pleading for answers. "What happened? Why am I here?" Dr. Green took a deep breath. There was no easy way to do this. "Mr. Thompson, you were in a car accident 3 days ago. Your injuries were severe, but you're going to recover physically." Steve's heart began to race. "And my family? My wife? My son?" The doctor's silence was deafening. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Thompson. Your wife and son, they didn't survive the crash." Steve's world shattered. A guttural cry escaped his lips as the memories came flooding back. The family outing, the intersection, the truck coming out of nowhere. "No, no, no, how? Why?" Steve wailed, clutching at his chest. "This can't be happening. Please tell me this isn't real." Dr. Green signaled to Lisa, who rushed in with a syringe of sedative. As she administered the injection, Dr. Green grasped Steve's hand firmly. "Mr. Thompson, I know this is impossibly hard, but you survived for a reason. Nothing in this life happens without purpose. Believe me." As the sedative took effect, Steve's anguished cries subsided into quiet sobs. The last thing he heard before drifting off was Dr. Green's voice, soft and reassuring. "Rest now. We'll talk more when you wake up." In the days that followed, Steve oscillated between numbing grief and burning anger. Why had he survived when Sarah and Tommy hadn't? What cruel twist of fate had spared him only to leave him in this living hell? Dr. Green visited him daily, offering words of comfort and encouragement. But Steve found little solace in platitudes about purpose and meaning. What purpose could there possibly be in losing everything he had ever loved? 2 weeks later, Steve Thompson stood in front of his office building, straightening his new suit. He had stopped by a boutique on the way, unable to face wearing any of the clothes from before. The fabric felt stiff and unfamiliar against his skin, much like the mask of composure he was trying to maintain. His secretary, Jenny, greeted him with red-rimmed eyes, handing him a stack of important documents and letters that had accumulated during his absence. "How did you manage without me?" Steve asked, attempting a weak joke. Jenny just nodded, unable to speak through her tears. "It's okay, Jenny," Steve said softly, patting her shoulder awkwardly. "We'll get through this." Alone in his office, Steve began sifting through the paperwork. Contracts, invoices, project reports. How meaningless it all seemed now. The business he had built from the ground up, the partnerships he had cultivated over years. What was the point of it all now? He picked up a framed photo on his desk, a snapshot of him, Sarah, and Tommy at the beach last summer. Sarah's smile was radiant, and Tommy was mid-laugh, sand covering his chubby legs. Steve felt a lump form in his throat. "I'm so sorry," he whispered to the photograph. "I should have protected you. I should have." A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Robert, his business partner. "Steve, my God, it's good to see you," Robert said, crossing the room to embrace him. "We've all been so worried. How are you holding up?" Steve forced a smile. "I'm managing. Thanks, Rob." They talked business for a while, Robert filling Steve in on what he'd missed. But Steve found it hard to concentrate. His mind kept drifting to Sarah and Tommy, to the life he'd lost. After Robert left, Steve found himself staring out the window at the bustling city below. He wanted to run, to escape to some remote forest or deserted island where no one would find him, where he wouldn't have to face the sympathetic looks and awkward condolences. Dr. Green's words echoed in his mind. Nothing happens without a purpose. But what possible purpose could there be in this tragedy? And did Steve even want to find out? He buried his face in his hands and wept, his sobs muffled by the stack of irrelevant papers on his desk. After work, Steve decided to walk home. He couldn't bear the thought of calling a cab and making small talk with the driver. Instead, he chose to cut through the ravine that divided the old and new parts of town. The path was well worn, used by locals for generations. Steve knew every inch of this ravine from his childhood explorations with neighborhood friends. As he walked, memories flooded back, of climbing trees, building forts, and coming home covered in mud to his mother's exasperated sighs. The autumn air was crisp, and fallen leaves crunched beneath his feet. For a moment, Steve felt a fleeting sense of peace, surrounded by the unchanging nature of this place. As he rounded a bend, a flash of movement caught his eye. Near a wild rose bush laden with bright orange berries sat a boy, no more than 12 years old. The child was hunched over, intently counting coins spilled from a round plastic container. The boy's appearance screamed street kid, the type the police periodically rounded up and sent to group homes. His clothes were tattered and dirty, his hair matted and unwashed. Steve found himself stopping, watching the scene unfold. Noticing Steve's presence, the boy quickly scrambled to his feet and approached, his voice rough as he whined, "Mister, spare some change? I'm hungry." Steve reached into his wallet and pulled out a couple of crisp $20 bills left over from his last car wash. Before. He pressed them into the boy's grimy hands. "What's your deal, kid? Group home not cutting it?" Steve asked, surprising himself with his interest. The boy grinned, revealing yellowed teeth. "Nah, it sucks there. Can't smoke, can't play cards, can't go where I want. Got sick of it. I'll bum around while it's warm. Maybe go back when it gets cold. If the cops don't grab me first," he chuckled. Steve felt a pang in his chest. This kid, barely older than Tommy would have been, was out here alone, fending for himself. "What about your parents? They alive?" he found himself asking. The boy's face darkened. "Mister, if I had living parents, you think I'd be in a group home? That's not how it works." Steve felt a wave of sadness wash over him. "Oh, kid, if only you knew. Things happen in ways you can't imagine," he thought, squinting against the setting sun that had suddenly emerged from behind a tree, painfully bright. When Steve opened his eyes again, the boy had vanished, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Steve's home was exactly as they had left it on that fateful day. His wife's bathrobe still hung in the bathroom. His son's favorite stuffed animal sat on the bed. Every corner held a memory, every object a reminder of what he had lost. As he walked through the silent house, Steve could almost hear the echoes of their life together. Sarah's laughter from the kitchen, Tommy's excited footsteps running down the hallway. The happiness that once filled these rooms now felt like a cruel joke. The housekeeper, Maria, brought him his correspondence and informed him that dinner would be ready in 10 minutes. Steve thanked her, marveling at how his staff carried on as if nothing had changed when his entire world had been turned upside down. "Will you be needing anything else, Mr. Thompson?" Maria asked, her eyes filled with sympathy. Steve shook his head. "No thank you, Maria. You can go home after you've set out dinner. I'll clean up." As he mechanically went through the motions of eating dinner and preparing for bed, Steve couldn't shake the feeling of unreality that had plagued him since leaving the hospital. Life seemed like a cruel joke, devoid of meaning or purpose. He found himself wandering into Tommy's room, untouched since that morning. Toy cars were scattered on the floor, a half-finished Lego structure on the desk. Steve picked up Tommy's favorite teddy bear, hugging it close as he sank onto the small bed. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry." That night, as he lay in the bed that suddenly felt too large, too empty, Steve made a decision. He couldn't continue like this, going through the motions of a life that no longer held any joy or purpose. Something had to change. But what and how? The question swirled in his mind as he drifted into a fitful sleep, haunted by dreams of screeching tires and shattering glass. Winter arrived in the city on December 20th, blanketing everything in a layer of pristine white snow. The path through the ravine that Steve had been using for his daily walks was now impassable, forcing him to drive to work. The streets were alive with the spirit of the approaching holidays. Costumed Santas and elves bustled about, Christmas markets were in full swing, and festive lights adorned every tree. But for Steve, the cheerful atmosphere only served to deepen his sense of loss and isolation. As he was driving home one evening, lost in thoughts of Christmases past, a figure in a blue snowflake-patterned coat caught his eye. It was a young woman dressed as a Christmas elf, leaning heavily on a crutch and clutching her lower back. Even from a distance, Steve could see she was in pain. Without really thinking about it, he pulled over and rolled down his window. "Miss, do you need help?" The woman waved him off with a forced smile, but as she did so, she cried out in pain and fell to her knees. Steve was out of his car in an instant, gently lifting the petite stranger into his arms. "It's okay, I've got you," he said softly, carefully placing her in the passenger seat. "I'm so sorry," she said between pained gasps. "This is terribly inconvenient. I think I've thrown out my back. Or rather, it's thrown me," she added with a weak laugh. Steve found himself smiling despite the situation. "Don't worry about it," he reassured her. "I'm Steve, by the way, Steve Thompson." "Olivia Finch," she replied, grimacing as she tried to find a comfortable position. "I was supposed to be doing a Christmas gig with my partner, but he ditched me 2 hours ago. Said he had to run an errand and never came back. Some Santa Claus he turned out to be," she grumbled. As they drove to the hospital, Steve found himself opening up to this stranger in a way he hadn't to anyone since the accident. There was something about Olivia's warmth and humor that made him feel alive again. "You know, this wasn't exactly how I planned to spend my evening," Olivia said as they waited in the ER. "But I have to say, as far as knights in shining armor go, you're not bad." Steve felt a blush creep up his neck. "Well, I don't know about that. Just doing what anyone would do." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Trust me, not everyone would. You'd be surprised how many people just walked right by me out there." As they continued to chat, Steve felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about his loss or his pain. He was just present. "Listen," he said as the nurse called Olivia's name. "Would it be okay if I checked in on you tomorrow? Just to make sure you're all right?" Olivia's face lit up with a smile that made Steve's heart skip a beat. "I'd like that very much, Steve. Thank you." As he watched her being wheeled away, Steve realized that for the first time since the accident, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The next day, true to his word, Steve visited Olivia at her home. He was greeted by a kind-faced older woman who introduced herself as Olivia's mother. "Oh, you must be the gentleman who helped Olivia last night," she said warmly. "Please come in. She's resting in the living room." Steve followed her into a cozy, cluttered living room. Olivia was resting on the couch, her face free of the Christmas elf makeup, looking impossibly young and vulnerable. She brightened when she saw Steve. "My hero returns," she said with a smile. "I can't thank you enough for your help last night, Steve." Steve felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. "It was nothing," he said, suddenly feeling shy. "I'm just glad you're okay. How's your back?" "Better, thanks to the magic of muscle relaxants," Olivia laughed. "I'll be fit as a fiddle in no time, just in time to go back to my real job." "Oh, what's that?" Steve asked, genuinely curious. "I'm studying to be a teacher," Olivia explained. "The Christmas elf gig was just to earn some extra cash for the holidays." As they chatted, Steve found himself reluctant to leave. There was something about Olivia's presence that made him feel lighter. When he finally stood to go, he found himself asking, "Would you like to have dinner sometime, to celebrate your recovery?" Olivia's face lit up. "I'd love to." As Steve left the Finch residence, he felt a flutter of excitement in his chest, a feeling he thought he'd never experience again. For the first time in months, he was looking forward to something. Steve and Olivia's dinner turned into a series of dates, and before they knew it, it was Christmas Eve. As they sat in a cozy restaurant, Steve found himself sharing more about his past than he had with anyone since the accident. "I lost my wife and son in a car crash 3 months ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think I'd ever feel happy again." Olivia reached across the table, gently taking his hand. "Steve, I'm so sorry. I can't even imagine what you've been going through." Steve squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her touch. "It's been hell," he admitted. "But being with you, it's the first time since the accident that I've felt like maybe, just maybe, life could be good again." Olivia's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Oh, Steve," she said softly, "I'm honored that I could help in any way. You're an amazing man, and you deserve happiness." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the soft strains of Christmas carols playing in the background. Then Olivia spoke again. "My mom stopped celebrating Christmas years ago," she said. "Ever since my dad left her on Christmas Day. And most of my friends celebrate with their families, so I usually just have a quiet night in with some champagne and whatever's on TV." Steve nodded sympathetically. "I was planning to drive out of town, somewhere quiet where I wouldn't have to deal with all the festivities. It's too painful, thinking about all the Christmases I'll never have with Sarah and Tommy." Olivia's eyes lit up suddenly. "Oh, I almost forgot. I'm heading to the children's home the day after tomorrow to do a Christmas show. Would you like to come with me?" Steve felt an inexplicable excitement at the idea. "To the children's home? That sounds wonderful. I'd love to join you." Olivia beamed. "Great, but we'll have to switch to a first-name basis if you're going to be my Santa Claus." "Deal!" Steve laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. "But I have to warn you, my ho-ho-ho might be a bit rusty." As they left the restaurant, snow began to fall softly around them. Steve looked up at the twinkling lights and the gently swirling snowflakes, and for the first time since the accident, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still some magic left in the world. 2 days later, Steve and Olivia pulled up to the gates of the children's home. Steve felt a mix of excitement and nervousness as he adjusted his Santa costume. "You look perfect," Olivia assured him, her eyes twinkling behind her Christmas elf mask. "The kids are going to love you." The guard, clearly impressed by Steve's luxury car, snapped to attention and welcomed them enthusiastically. "Welcome, welcome. The children are so excited for your visit." As they were ushered into the auditorium, Steve's eyes scanned the sea of excited children, searching for a face he wasn't sure he'd recognize. But the boy from the ravine wasn't among them. The show began, and Steve threw himself into his role as Santa Claus with gusto, his booming ho 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 eliciting squeals of delight from the children. Olivia danced and sang, her voice clear and sweet as she led the children in Christmas carols. Steve found himself genuinely enjoying the performance. The children's joy was infectious, their innocence and enthusiasm a balm to his wounded soul. For a few hours, he was able to forget his pain and lose himself in the magic of the season. Finally, it was time to hand out gifts. Steve sat in his makeshift ice throne, a chair draped in white fabric and decorated with tinfoil snowflakes. One by one, the children approached, reciting poems or singing songs before receiving their presents. "You're a natural," Olivia whispered to him during a brief lull. "These kids adore you." Steve felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. For the first time in months, he felt like he was doing something meaningful, something good. Suddenly, a boy of about 7 in a Superman costume stepped forward. "I'm Vince," he announced proudly before launching into his poem. Steve felt the world tilt on its axis. The boy in front of him was the spitting image of his son who had died in the car crash. Same blonde hair, same bright blue eyes, same dimpled smile. Even the way he stood, with one hand on his hip in a classic superhero pose, was identical to Tommy's favorite stance. "My son," Steve whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "It's my son." Olivia, noticing Steve's distress, quickly took over the gift-giving while the home's nurse gave Steve some calming tea. But Steve couldn't take his eyes off Vince. It was impossible, and yet, the resemblance was uncanny. When he had composed himself, Steve explained the situation to the staff. They were skeptical, but agreed to show him the boy's birth certificate. To Steve's amazement, Vince had been born on the same day and in the same city as his son, but the parents listed on the certificate were different. Steve's mind raced. Could it be possible? Had Sarah given birth to twins and given one up for adoption? But why? And why had she never told him? As they left the children's home that evening, Steve's head was spinning with questions and possibilities. Olivia listened patiently as he talked through his theories, offering support and gentle reality checks when his imagination ran wild. "Steve," she said gently as they sat in his car outside her apartment, "I know this is a lot to process, but whatever happens, whatever you discover, I want you to know that I'm here for you. You don't have to go through this alone." Steve looked at her, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion he saw in her eyes. Without thinking, he leaned in and kissed her softly. When they parted, both were slightly breathless. "Thank you, Olivia," Steve said softly, "for everything." As he drove home that night, Steve felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite untangle. Grief for the family he had lost, hope for the possibility of a son he might have found, and a growing affection for Olivia that both excited and terrified him. Whatever happened next, he knew his life would never be the same. Over the next few weeks, Steve threw himself into unraveling the mystery of Vince's origins. With Olivia's help and support, he arranged for a paternity test, which confirmed his suspicions. Vince was indeed his biological son. "I can't believe it," Steve said, staring at the results in disbelief. "He's really my son, but how? Why?" Olivia squeezed his hand reassuringly. "We'll figure it out, Steve. One step at a time." Their investigation led them to a shocking discovery. Vince had been stolen at birth by a nurse who had planned to sell him to a family overseas. Sarah had been told that the second twin hadn't survived. The nurse was caught at the border, and Vince had ended up in the foster care system. "But why didn't they return him to us?" Steve wondered aloud, pacing Olivia's living room. "We would have taken him in a heartbeat." Olivia watched him with sympathetic eyes. "Maybe she couldn't bear to take him after being told he had died. It must have been so traumatic for her." Steve nodded slowly, the pieces finally falling into place. He remembered how devastated Sarah had been after the birth, how she had struggled with postpartum depression. At the time, he had attributed it to the difficulty of the birth and adjusting to motherhood. Now, he understood the true depth of her pain. "She never knew," he said softly. "She died thinking we only had one son." Olivia stood and wrapped her arms around him. I'm so sorry, Steve. For Sarah, for you, for everything you've been through. Steve held her close, drawing comfort from her presence. Thank you, he whispered. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Steve felt a sense of peace wash over him. He no longer cared about the whys and hows. All that mattered was that he had a chance to be a father again, to give Vince the home and family he deserved. I want to adopt him, Steve said suddenly. Vince, I want to bring him home. Olivia smiled up at him. I think that's a wonderful idea, Steve. That little boy deserves a loving family, and you deserve a chance to be a father again. Steve kissed her softly. Will you help me? I don't think I can do this alone. Of course, Olivia replied without hesitation. We'll do this together. On a frosty January morning, Steve brought Vince home. The boy's eyes were wide with wonder as he took in the grand house, his new room filled with toys and books. Is this really all for me? Vince asked, his voice filled with awe as he explored his room. Steve knelt down beside him, his heart swelling with love for this child he was just getting to know. It sure is, buddy. Welcome home. Olivia had helped prepare everything, and as Steve watched her show Vince around, his heart swelled with a feeling he thought he'd never experience again. Hope. After a celebratory lunch, Olivia started gathering her things to leave. Vince looked from her to Steve, confusion evident on his face. Why is Mom leaving? Isn't she staying with us? He asked innocently. Steve and Olivia exchanged a look of surprise, then slowly, matching smiles spread across their faces. You know what, buddy? Steve said, kneeling down to Vince's level. I think that's an excellent idea. What do you say, Olivia? Want to stick around? Olivia's eyes filled with happy tears as she knelt beside them, pulling Vince into a warm embrace. Of course, sweetheart, she whispered. I'm not going anywhere. As Steve watched Olivia and Vince, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. The tragedy that had shattered his world had also, miraculously, led him to this moment. He had a son to love, a woman who brought light back into his life, and the chance to build a new family. That night, after Vince had gone to bed, Steve and Olivia sat on the porch, looking up at the star-filled sky. Thank you, Steve said softly, for everything, for being there for me, for helping me find Vince, for loving us. Olivia leaned her head on his shoulder. You don't have to thank me, Steve. You two have brought so much joy into my life. I should be thanking you. Steve wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. I love you, Olivia, he said, the words feeling both terrifying and absolutely right. I love you too, Steve, she replied, tilting her face up to kiss him. As they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, Steve thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, the pain, the loss, the unexpected twists of fate. Dr. Green's words came back to him. Nothing in this life happens without purpose. Looking at Olivia, thinking of Vince sleeping peacefully upstairs, Steve finally understood what that purpose could be. Life had broken him down, but it had also given him the chance to rebuild, to create something beautiful from the ashes of his past. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky, Steve Thompson, once broken by tragedy, felt his heart swell with hope for the future. A future filled with love, family, and the endless possibilities of new beginnings.